No one expected the greatest conqueror in Europe to collapse so quickly. Yet by 1812, the man who once shook the entire continent stood on the edge of a downfall he never saw coming. How did Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius, a reformer, a ruler feared by kings, end up surrounded, betrayed, exiled, and ultimately destroyed by the very ambitions that built his empire? Why did the same strategy that made him unstoppable become the reason for his defeat? And how did Europe, terrified for over a decade, finally unite to bring him down? In this video, we are going to discuss all these things. So let's start. Napoleon's rise had been so rapid, so dramatic, that Europe barely had time to understand what was happening. Born in Corsica, a small island far from the centers of power, he entered the French military at a moment when the old world was collapsing. The French Revolution had torn apart society, destroyed the monarchy, and thrown Europe into chaos. In that chaos, Napoleon found his opportunity. His early campaigns in Italy turned a relatively unknown general into a legend. He moved faster than any army of his time, struck where enemies least expected, and defeated forces much larger than his own. His soldiers adored him. France needed a hero. Napoleon became one. By 1799, he seized control of the government, declaring himself first consul. A few years later, he crowned himself emperor. Under him, France became a machine of war and administration, efficient, disciplined, and unstoppable. His reforms reshaped laws, education, and the economy. His military victories redrew the map of Europe, but the seeds of his fall were already there. Napoleon believed that if something stood in his way, he could simply conquer it, and for a long time, he was right. His greatest mistake began with Britain. The British Navy controlled the seas, and Napoleon knew France could never defeat them head-on. So he turned to a new strategy, the continental system. An economic blockade meant to strangle Britain as trade, but enforcing it meant forcing every European nation, friend or enemy, to obey French interests. The plan backfired. Instead of weakening Britain, it angered France's allies, hurt European economies, and pushed countries away from Napoleon rather than towards him. One nation suffered most under this pressure: Russia. Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had once been allies, but by 1812, distrust, economic struggle, and pride made war inevitable. This was the turning point, the moment historians call the beginning of the end. Napoleon gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grand Army, more than 600,000 strong. With this force, he invaded Russia, confident he would crush resistance in weeks. Instead, Russia refused to fight a traditional war. They retreated, burning their own towns, their own crops, leaving nothing behind. Napoleon marched deeper and deeper into empty land. When he finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and burning. The city offered no supplies, no shelter, nothing to feed his exhausted army. Winter arrived early, temperatures fell, horses died, soldiers froze, thousands starved. Napoleon realized the truth too late. He had walked into a trap. The retreat from Russia became one of the most disastrous events in military history. Almost his entire army was destroyed, not by battle, but by cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Only a fraction survived. Europe smelled blood. Old enemies that once feared him now sensed opportunity. Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia joined together for one final push. Napoleon tried to rebuild his army, but France had been drained by years of war. The new soldiers were young, inexperienced, and vastly outnumbered. The decisive moment came in 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. For the first time, almost all of Europe fought against Napoleon at once. The defeat was crushing. Napoleon was forced to retreat back into France as his empire collapsed around him. By 1814, Paris was surrounded. Napoleon had no choice but to abdicate. The man who once ruled most of Europe was exiled to the small island of Elba, a humiliating fall for someone who once dreamed of global power. But Napoleon was not finished. In 1815, he escaped Elba and returned to France. The moment he stepped on French soil, something unbelievable happened. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined him, shouting his name. Within days, he regained control of the country without firing a single shot. Europe was stunned. They call it the 100 Days, Napoleon's last, dramatic attempt to reclaim his empire. Everything came down to one final battle, Waterloo, here, facing the British under Duke Wellington and the Prussians under Blücher. Napoleon fought with the same brilliance that once made him invincible. But luck was not on his side. Of communication failures, muddy terrain, exhausted troops, and the arrival of the Prussian reinforcements turned the tide. As evening fell, Napoleon's army collapsed. This defeat was final. Napoleon was captured and exiled again, but this time to St. Helena, a remote island in the Atlantic where escape was impossible. There, far from Europe, far from armies and politics, the emperor who once controlled continents spent his final years reflecting on his legacy, writing his own story, and defending his choices. He died in 1821, only 51 years old. But the world he left behind was forever changed. Napoleon reshaped Europe's borders, spread reforms that still influence laws today, and inspired revolutions across the world. His fall marked the end of an age of empires built on conquest, and the beginning of a new political order in Europe, one based on diplomacy, balance of power, and national identity. In the end, Napoleon did not fall because he was weak. He fell because he was too strong, too ambitious, too confident that victory would always belong to him. His rise was brilliant, his fall was dramatic, and his legacy still defines the history of Europe.